Good evening, everyone. I'm Dayna Cunningham, Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts. Welcome to this evening's forum on Willful Defiance, the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline with author Mark Warren and activists Zakiya Sankara-Jabar and Lorraine Wright. It is wonderful to see so many of the Tufts community joining us virtually for this very important conversation. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Tufts University Prison Initiative of Tisch College, what we call TUPIT, Tufts Civic, the Education Department and the Civic Studies program for making today's program possible. I'm pleased to introduce Mark Warren, author of Willful Defiance. Willful Defiance tells the story of how Black and Brown parents and students organized to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline in their local schools and built a movement that spread across the country. Warren's book examines organizing processes in Mississippi, Los Angeles, and Chicago, showing how parents and students of color changed exclusionary discipline that led students into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Mark is a professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. A sociologist and a community-engaged scholar, he studies and works with community, parent, and youth organizing groups seeking to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and American democratic life. He has co-founded several networks promoting activist scholarship, community organizing, and education justice. Also joining us this evening are Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, the co-founder of and director of Racial Justice Now, and Lorraine Wright, the executive director of the Richmond-based organization, I Vote for Me. Both organizations are members of the National Dignity in Schools campaign, which is dedicated to dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. They will later be joined by our moderator, Hilary Binda. Hilary is director of the program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and a senior lecturer in Civic Studies at Tufts. She is the founding director of the Tufts University Prison Initiative of Tisch College, TUPIT. TUPIT brings Tufts faculty and students together with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, educators, organizers, corrections staff, and scholars of criminal justice to facilitate creative and collaborative responses to the problems of mass incarceration and racial justice. TUPIT's work includes teaching a cohort of students at MCI Concord, providing resources and courses to returning citizens as part of My Turn, a 4-course civic studies certificate program for people directly impacted by the carceral system, joining students from the Tufts campus with those in prison in its Inside Out program, and educating its on-campus community through symposia, films, and a speaker series. 2 quick notes on this evening's proceedings before I turn the program over to Mark, who will introduce a short video and presentation and present his work to us. Following his presentation will be remarks by Zakiya and Lorraine before they come together for a conversation moderated by Hilary. But I just want to say this is a conversation as a Black mother that I have a personal stake in, as many of the Black mothers I know do. My son, when he was 2 years old in preschool, was called antisocial, aggressive, and weird because he stepped away from a child who grabbed his bicycle on the playground. And for that, he was called antisocial, aggressive, and weird. And so I think for so many of us, this conversation so deeply connects to our experience fighting for our children to be seen in institutions as the incredible, intrepid learners and human beings that they are. And so I want to express my personal gratitude to all of you for doing this work. Thank you again to our guests for joining us. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you so much, Dayna, for welcoming us and hosting us tonight, and to the great folks over at Tisch College, Jessica, Shanley, and others who I know did a lot of work to put this together. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my work and the work with my community partners who are here tonight with you. And this is a book. I am the author of the book, but it's actually a collective project. It's based on 6 and 7 years of deep partnerships with the organizations that are featured in the book. And one of those groups, Sacramento Area Youth Speaks, wanted to put together a spoken word piece in support and in association with the book as a way for them to express themselves on the occasion of the book coming out. And so we want to start by showing that. It's about 5 minutes long. I think you will find it to be powerful and a good way to set a context for our conversation today. So thank you.
They don't care if our babies thrive at school, long as they get by at school. Get by institutionalized racism and intergenerational oppression systems that keep prison pipelines thriving. Disguised as willful defiance, I'm trying to understand why urban schools have the highest rates of incarceration instead of culturally relevant curriculum that should be liberation. Suspensions from school feel like eternity. Strategically guide the black and brown kids out when we truly come to school to get free. Stifle academic and social emotional education. I'm just saying, could this be racially motivated? Outcomes being primarily black and brown youth become academically stagnated, leading to suspensions, expulsions, less school participation, stereotypes perpetuated. Is your school pedagogy, discipline, or human elevation? Discipline data from the Department of Education found that black girls are 5 times more likely than white girls to be suspended at least once from school. This data infuriating. When black girls are 7 times more likely to receive multiple out-of-school suspensions, where is the healing, motivation, and rebuilding? How do we stand in our confidence after it has been disciplined away? How do I come to school ready to learn when you are trying to strip my intelligence and make it seem like I am insane? Black girls are 3 times more likely to receive referrals to law enforcement when white girls are getting away with behaving the same way. And we already know what they are doing to black and brown boys. It's insane. Just check the data, it's been staying the same. I mean, steady increasing is definitely a shame. Do we want to teach black boys or do we want to lead them away to trajectories that don't lead to school or higher education degrees? Schools act like they are paid to lead them to the police when it's supposed to be a safe haven to keep youth off the streets. Expand opportunities, increase chances to succeed. Shouldn't school be focused on how to keep young people engaged and excited to be in their seats? Stop mistaking our pride for reasons for us to collide with suspensions, infractions, eventually leading to the police. We try to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. It's definitely time for us to get free. Who their students are and the environment they are living in. What students have to go through when they go home and live through before they can make it back to school again. Have you taken the time out to comprehend the life experiences of the children you are teaching and how your experience greatly differs from them? We have to remember school can empower or be a major hindrance. Is your school pushing towards prison or the most beautiful existence? The difference is we fighting for educational justice. Trust us, we won't stop until our babies get free. Educational liberation means we have to fight for what we believe. You can't suspend the truth out of our youth. You can't expel a generation that's meant to prevail. We demand an education where we can be more than our ancestors' wildest dreams. We want to go to school and truly be free.
Can somebody explain to me why? As soon as we enter the room, the teacher says bye-bye. We not getting paid enough. Why should I care for kids that don't care for self? That's just one last brother we have to worry about getting well. Can somebody explain to me why young sisters is being suspended disproportionately, hand-bound and kicked out of school for throwing attention tantrums, sent out on Zoom for sending messages? Pipe down, little black girl. you're too domineering. Pushed out, harshly disciplined, over criminalized, school not made for a black girl to shine. Can somebody explain to me why all my beautiful black and brown faces sitting in courtrooms over classrooms? Juvenile offenders, minor underage, facing life rather than graduating. Something is wrong with this country's education. We losing our babies, perpetuating racism in a system that's not set up for us to win. And parents don't send their kids to school, we criminalize them. It's clear to me education is not for liberation, it's for disciplining. Can somebody explain to me why? Officer on campus arresting teens, placing minor in custody. It's a shame we live in a nation that doesn't invest in education. Can somebody explain to me why? Being black in school is a crime. My skin not willfully defiant, it's just a dirty trap to keep us trapped in the school-to-prison pipeline.
Okay, thank you so much for showing that performance. I'm going to talk now for about 15 minutes and try to give you a little bit of an overview of the book and what I've been learning from folks like Zakiya and Lorraine who are here today and have tried to lift up and express in this book, Willful Defiance, the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Willful defiance can be defined in many ways. According to the California Education Code, here you're seeing their definition: disrupting school activities or otherwise willfully defying the authority of educators. And you may not know that schools every year suspend hundreds of thousands of students for something called willful defiance. Sometimes it's called disrupting school or willful disruption. It's a vague category, a subjective category, and it involves anything from wearing your hat, refusing to take your hat off, to challenging a teacher to say, well, why are our history textbooks published in Texas? Is this really the kind of history that we should be learning? Students are being suspended, particularly Black and brown students, those with disabilities, are suspended hundreds of thousands of times for this kind of willful defiance. In many states, it's actually a criminal offense. And in the corner on the bottom, you see one of the famous cases in Spring Valley, South Carolina, where a girl, Shakara, refused to turn in her cell phone. Actually, she said she didn't have one. The teacher called the security guard, who came and body slammed her to a ground. Another girl, Naya Kenny, that you see pictured here, took a cell phone video of it, which went viral. And they were both arrested and charged with criminal disruption of school in the state. And there actually had to be a grassroots organizing movement to get them to drop those charges. It was actually a key point in the movement that that sort of emerged as the movement for police-free schools, which we could talk about a little bit more later. In any case, we called the book Willful Defiance in a way to highlight that, but in some ways to flip the script. Because what we find is that unfortunately, so many schools have set up a school discipline and policing system that is designed to punish, control, and criminalize students. And in this situation, we believe that young people and their families do need to willfully defy this system. But when individuals try to stand up on their own to defy it or to challenge it, they are often themselves punished, disciplined. Parents are often bullied or abused and sometimes arrested. And so it's really a reference to building a movement of people to willfully defy this system, along with other students and parents of color in communities across the country. And that's what this book is about. Oops. I'm not going to talk a lot about my journey to this project. I'm happy to talk about that later. But I will say that I've been studying and working with community organizing groups for over 25 years, working on racial equity and educational justice issues. And around about 10 years ago, I and my colleagues came out with a book called A Match on Dry Grass, which was about community organizing efforts at educational justice. And we really treated them as local groups. in their localities, kind of in a box. But by the time the book came out, that was already a little bit outdated. And what we were seeing was the emergence of educational justice movements on a national scale. And this was really led by the movement to combat the school-to-prison pipeline. And I had been out talking with parents and young people for that book, A Match on Dry Grass. And even though we didn't focus on the school-to-prison pipeline in that book, more and more what we were hearing from young people was, our schools feel like prisons. They're full of armed police and security guards, metal detectors, and I visited some schools where, in Chicago, the Chicago police actually had police substations located in schools and were arresting and booking children right in the school and sending them into the criminal and juvenile justice system. I went to Los Angeles and found out that the Los Angeles school police actually owned a tank and semi-military weapons. And there was actually an organizing campaign that documented in the book to get the school police to return the tank and these semi-automatic weapons to the federal government. In any case, I became convinced that really the school-to-prison pipeline and this zero-tolerance, harsh discipline practices and policing practices were really the key educational justice issue facing our young people of color in our schools today, and set out to partner with a number of organizations to document not just what was happening to young people and parents and lift up those stories, but really to focus on how people were coming together to organize to change those systems. And we worked together on a number of projects, including producing a toolkit on organizing to combat the school-to-prison pipeline, co-produced with the Dignity in Schools campaign and housed on their website. So we were committed to producing knowledge and lifting up and sharing these stories and documentation of the movement, but also to producing resources that would really support and strengthen the movement to change. We wanted to produce research that was actually relevant to changing the systemic racism that so many of our young people and families are facing in schools. I'm not going to talk a lot about what the school-to-prison pipeline is, but it did arise in the 90s as part of the larger system of mass incarceration that Michelle Alexander has described as a new Jim Crow. And just as zero tolerance policing practices were happening in communities and 3 strikes and you're out, and the rise of mass incarceration, the same thing was happening in our schools. And so in the 1970s, there were only 100 police officers in all schools across the entire country. By the early 2000s, there were 16,000, and that number has only increased. And I think what is not very well understood is my view that mass incarceration actually starts in school. And as parents are being criminalized, Black and brown parents are being criminalized outside of school, their children are being criminalized and sent on the road to prison in school. Fully 1/4 of all African-American children by the age of 14 will have a parent who has been in prison at some time, 1/4. If you fail to graduate high school and you are a Black man in this country without a high school degree, your chances of ending up in prison at some point in your life are 2/3. So in other words, 2/3 of all Black men without a high school degree will be in prison at any one time. At some point in their lives, 1/3 are in prison right at any one moment. So this is a deep systemic issue that is connected, that it happens in schools, but it's connected to the criminalization system in our larger society. In any case, the book really tries to tell the story of the school-to-prison pipeline. And I went down to Holmes County in the Mississippi Delta to start to meet some of the first people who had named and challenged what they called at the time the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. And this was in the mid-1990s in one of the poorest rural areas in the country, a place that of the old slave system, but also a place that had been a center of the civil rights movement. And so there was a movement organizing tradition there, as well as this deep-seated discipline and controlling system in the schools. And they back in the 1990s, and I think it's important to understand this, the first people to name and challenge the school-to-prison pipeline were not researchers like myself. They weren't legal advocates or traditional civil rights advocates in Washington. They weren't educators. They weren't education policy makers. All of these groups were really blind to what was happening in this country. The people who named and challenged the system first were people who were most directly impacted by it. And I think that is one of the most significant findings in this book, and something that anybody who's concerned with challenging and changing what's happening in our schools need to take to heart, that the real source of energy and sharp analysis of systemic oppression in our schools and in our communities comes out of the direct experiences and analytical insights of people who have been most impacted. There were a number of famous cases that happened in this community at the time. There was a case where, and this is back in the mid-1990s, over 25 years ago, a group of students were on a bus throwing popcorn at each other. The Black students, the popcorn hit the back of the school bus driver. She drove the bus straight to the police station, and 7 African-American boys were arrested and charged with criminal assault for hitting the back of the school bus driver with a piece of popcorn. And so this, for them, captured the idea of the school-to-prison pipeline, and they became organizing against it. And the early chapters of the book try to document how they organized locally to change these kinds of systems. I then travel around the country, places like Chicago and Los Angeles that I mentioned, in Denver, Colorado, and really try to understand how parents and young people who were challenging the system very early on were coming together to organize, to change, to try to change these policies and practices, and then how these local struggles were then connected up to each other nationally. And so I go to Los Angeles and looked at one of the first victories against zero tolerance school discipline policies that was pioneered by a group of Black and brown parents and a group called Cadre in South Los Angeles. And they were the grassroots organizing force behind the effort to get that school district to adopt school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports. That victory was then lifted up and reverberated across the country, and was really the spark that helped form the Dignity in Schools campaign nationally. And then I look at how the formation of these national movements did not become dominated by professional advocates in Washington, but in fact, these organizers developed national alliances that were centering the experiences of people who were most impacted, and then devoting their resources and their energy to supporting local struggles. It was a different way of thinking about national civil rights organizations or national movement organizations, not as dominated in Washington by people with more resources, expertise, and connections, but instead dedicating those resources and alliances and those connections to the struggles that people were happening locally. And I do think that that is the only way to really understand the success of this movement, because the school-to-prison pipeline was a very, very deep-seated and continues to be deep-seated, but zero tolerance school discipline in the year 2008, when the Dignity in Schools campaign formed, was the law of the land. It was enshrined in every district, just about every district policy, almost every state legislation enshrined zero tolerance discipline. It was a position of the federal government. Both national teachers unions adopted zero tolerance discipline. Every national education association in the country had a zero tolerance discipline policy to suspend students for things like willful defiance. And so when this grassroots movement first started, they were up against a huge systemic issue. And within 8 years, they have defeated zero tolerance, at least rhetorically. All of the teachers unions, all of the education associations, the federal government, most states across the country and most districts have now rejected zero tolerance, at least as their official position. And we can talk about, the changes of what's actually happening in our schools. And now police-free schools is really the next frontier of that. And so this book is trying to really grapple with and lift up the stories of what people are doing locally, but how the fact that they have been able to connect nationally has really provided the strength and the power that they need to win locally. I also chart in the book the emergence of this movement as diverse, intergenerational, and intersectional movement. I think this is a really challenging effort, and really the creative work of parents and young people and organizers to do this. How can it be that a movement that really targets the mass suspensions of Black and brown boys can also lift up and shine a light on the experiences, in particular experiences of Black girls, girls of color, and gender nonconforming students, and address their particular needs without taking away a spotlight from also what is happening to Black and brown boys. The intergenerational nature of the movement is absolutely central, and a struggle to maintain a movement where young people and parents and adult community members can come together and work together. And then the book also charts the more recent emergence of the police-free schools movement. When the mass protests against police violence and racism emerged a couple of years ago, there became the demand for police-free schools that was won in several places across the country. And what most people don't understand is that the places where local organizing efforts won defunding or removing police from schools were places where people have been organizing in this movement for over 10 years. They seized on the energy of the mass protests, but they had laid the foundation for this work through political education, through relationship building, through developing policies and plans to submit to boards of education. And so the book also tries to highlight this kind of certainly the necessary work of mass protests, but the need to combine that with long-term organizing that really develops the leadership of people in communities and policies over time. I don't have time to go in great detail about all of the successes of this movement. I mentioned changing the national discourse away from zero tolerance, rolling series of victories at local and state levels, some serious reductions in what we call exclusionary discipline, suspensions and expulsions. In Los Angeles in 2008, there were 75,000 lost days of instruction due to suspensions and expulsions. And an organizing efforts that occurred over a period of 7 or 8 years eventually got the Board of Education to ban suspensions for willful defiance. And by 2018, the number of suspensions had dropped from 75,000 to 5,600. So very serious reductions that really mattered to the ability of Black and Brown students to remain in school and, hopefully learning while they're there. And then newer efforts to defund and remove police from schools. Nevertheless, really enduring challenges, enduring racial disparities. So the numbers of suspensions have started to fall across the country, but the fact that Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white children still is true. The persistence of police and policing practices and actually new forms of surveillance that have emerged with pandemic, what we are sometimes calling now the pandemic to prison pipeline. And then the challenge of how do we really create authentic alternatives that really transform schools, restorative justice being one of them, and I think we're going to talk more about that later. So I want to end with this overview with the challenge that we are talking about challenging and changing school discipline and policing practices, but really the school-to-prison pipeline is the result of multiple factors, not just discipline and policing, the really underfunding and equitable funding of our schools, a curriculum that is culturally irrelevant to the students of color who are experiencing the schools that are fortresses in communities rather than really emerging out of the community and connected to the community. So we really want the conversation about challenging the school-to-prison pipeline and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline to really open up a larger conversation. If we say that our public education system is based on white supremacy, which it is, what is it really going to take to transform that into an education system that is really about freedom and liberation for our young people, and not just an education system, but a larger society that really values and cares for and uplifts all of our children and provides them with the education and the resources that they need to be free. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my friends and partners in this work, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar and Lorraine Wright. So I'm not sure who was going next. Was it Zakiya? Were you going to go next?
I'm not sure. Am I up next?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
You are.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for that introduction. And so I'm Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. I'm the co-founder and co-director for Racial Justice Now. Racial Justice Now was actually founded out of my own experience as a mother. At the time, my son was 3 years old and he was being identified by his preschool teachers in the administration as a problem. And the type of language that they used to describe my child signaled to me that something was wrong with what was happening there. I eventually started to talk to other mothers at this center. We were at a center that was not very diverse. And at that time, I wasn't initially thinking it was a racial justice issue until I talked to those other mothers. And then at the time I was in college. And so on my college campus, I got into JSTOR and I just did a quick JSTOR check and I put in Black boys in education. And so as you can imagine, all kinds of things came up, information, books, research. And I literally went down the rabbit hole, as they say. I read about, all of the research by activist scholars. Gloria Latz and Billings was one of them. But Dr. Janice Hale Williams, who had done a lot of work around learning styles in African-American children. And then finally, I came across Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu's work, and he had started writing about Black boys' experience in K-12 education in the early 80s. And so here I am, as a mom, born in the early 80s, and the same experiences that he was outlining in his book at that time was literally still happening when I'm bringing in a new generation, into our world. I'm facing the same things he was writing about when I was a baby, literally, with my own child. And once I say we, because I have another co-founder, Dr. Vernelia Randall, who at the time was a professor of law at the University of Dayton School of Law. She's also not a professor who sort of just sat in the ivory tower. I knew her because she was always in the community. I would see her at Kwanzaa events, and she was always talking about racial equity and racial justice issues. At that time, her expertise was racial equity in healthcare, because she had been a nurse before becoming a law school professor. And she and I began to just, along with having conversations with other moms themselves, we also began to look at the data. I actually saw the very first research published by Dr. Walter S. Gilliam. He was out of the Yale Child Study Center. He's now done 2 extensive research projects around preschool expulsion specifically. And I had an opportunity to talk with him. So I was really blessed to have, to be married, so to speak, with activist professors who cared about this issue, who helped support me and other mothers as we were advocating for practice and policy change. We organized literally hundreds of Black mothers across the entire state of Ohio once we became known in the community for our work around ending the preschool-to-prison pipeline. We actually educated so many others in our community, whether their kids were grown and in college. They had no idea that kids that young, 3 to 5 years old, was actually being kicked out of schools, being expelled, being suspended. What we found was that a lot of the mothers that we were working with dealt with a lot of shame. Some mothers had even lost their jobs because their young children had been kicked out of schools and they didn't have anywhere for them to stay, didn't have a support system. So it was real. It became an economic justice issue. Most of these mothers are poor and working class. At the time, I was very much working class because I was in college trying to better my economic outcomes by being a college graduate and all of that. So this issue became front and center for us in Dayton, and we eventually connected with people across the entire state. It was our organization, this small group of scrappy moms, Black moms from Dayton, making waves at the State House. We learned through our research at the time that there was already a bill sitting in the Ohio Senate to repeal Ohio's zero tolerance law. But the way politics is, right, I learned a lot through this process about how laws get made and all the stuff in between. It was actually introduced by a Democrat, State Senator Charlita Tavares. She was, in the minority party, so her bill never got a hearing. But it was State Senator Peggy Lehner, who is the chairwoman of the Education Committee in the Ohio Senate at the time, and she happened to represent Dayton, even though she's a Republican. And so we just made a call and was like, we'd like to, have a meeting with you here in your district. We want to talk to you about some things that's happening and want to figure out why haven't you given this bill a hearing? And to our surprise, honestly, to our surprise, she responded immediately. This is Senator Lehner. She met with us at a restaurant, and she literally diligently took notes. There was a couple of times when we were telling her what was happening to our kids. She said, "Oh no, we're not doing that in Ohio." We were like, yes, it's happening in Ohio. And I have to say this because one of the things that we had to use as leverage at that time with State Senator Lehner is that she had just championed and passed into law. It was her bill, a third grade reading law in Ohio. And so our leverage was, how are you going to have a third grade reading law when some kids, primarily Black kids, are getting kicked out when they're 3 years old, right? And so she said this did not come up during the process, right, of making that bill. And it said, this is exactly why directly impacted people have to be brought in as interested parties. And when she heard that from us, she began to join us in making sure that we were at those meetings. We began to bring parents from all across the state because we knew that we needed parents in other areas to say, this is not just a Dayton issue. This is happening all across Ohio and really all across the country. And so it took several sessions, unfortunately, to get that done. But we eventually was able to get it done. And Ohio changed and repealed much of its zero tolerance law once we, had the stories from all of the people across the state. Obviously, the data was there. And we had to work, of course, with other organizations like the Ohio Education Association, Ohio Federation of Teachers, which is both of the two biggest teachers unions. There was the Ohio School Board Association and so many people. And at first, of course, it was hard because they did not want to have change. People are used to the status quo and they were worried about, this type of change happening and what could happen. But thankfully, as Mark mentioned, we had support from the Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national organization, as he mentioned, that support grassroots organizations like mine. They give us funding, they give us access to other organizations and the tools and strategies that they used to become successful. It became a big family. It still is a big family. And so we had a lot of support over the years to get that work done. We also ended up being successful at the local level as well within Dayton Public Schools itself. We were able to get Dayton Public Schools to ban preschool expulsions and suspensions. And you guys would not believe, but unfortunately, the local teachers union gave us the biggest fight on that. And it was really sad to hear some of the teachers talk about really little kids the way that they did. It was really heartbreaking. I had no idea people could use such harmful, horrific language about babies, literally. That's how I see 3-year-olds, 3 and 4-year-olds. And so obviously the teachers union has a lot of power. They have a lot of leverage with the district. And so we had to use our own leverage. Thankfully, we had an elected school board and we had relationships with several of those school board members, especially 2 of the Black members who were very rooted in community. And it literally came down to 1 vote. And I still remember Dr. Hazel Roundtree. She was the deciding vote to say, we can't do this in Dayton Public Schools. We do not want to be on the front page of Dayton Daily News saying that we're expelling our babies out of our schools when we have a 3rd grade reading law that we have to make sure our young people know how to read by 3rd grade. And so that was the start for us of building a relationship with the local school district, even state legislators. And it's been a rough and hard road because there were plenty of times that parents will call me and say, when is this all going to change? Like, what's wrong? Like, when are these things going to change? And unfortunately, for those of you who have had to, work on policy, whether that's in DC or in your own state, that things don't change quickly. It's really hard to get this type of change, to shake up the status quo and how we're treating our children. To me, it seems like it's a no-brainer. You think that people just do what's right. But I found out that that's not always the case. But we had to remain consistent. We had to remain vigilant. We did remain vigilant, and we continued and got that repeal. The other thing that we were able to do was actually get the Republican state of Ohio, because they control everything there, the House, the Senate, and the governor's seat. We had to continue to work with them. And specifically Senator Lehner. Education was something that she cared very much about. Her son was a teacher. And that was like, her issue. You know how some state elected officials, they have an issue. Education was hers. And so we were just surprised at how much she worked with us, because number one, we're Black. We didn't vote for her, right? We happen to live in her district, because we know how crazy they draw these lines, when they're redistricting, things like that, to hold on to their seats. But she happened to be, a decent person to work with. So anyway, I see that my time is up. I'm happy to answer, any questions. I want to say while I'm wrapping up is that we have expanded. Racial Justice Now also has a chapter now in the DC region, Montgomery County, Maryland, and we're working specifically now with changing outcomes for Black students in Montgomery County public schools. So I'm looking forward to the questions later. Thanks.
Thanks, Zakiya. I think I'm just gonna jump on in. So I wanna say first a big thank you to Tufts University for hosting us. So everyone, my name is Lorraine Wright. I am the Executive Director of I Vote For Me, which is a community-based organization here in Richmond, Virginia, that's premised on self-advocacy and the protection of human rights. And much like Zakiya, I had a similar experience, and advocacy actually chose me. So I was told that my firstborn, my son, Branson, would be retained in the 1st and 3rd grades. And that was a hard and a really tough pill for me to swallow, A, because I knew my son was brilliant, but B, I was the PTA president. So I was not only in school, but in my son's classroom several times a week, each and every week. So towards the end of the marking period, when his teacher called and said, well, we have to have a potential retention meeting, I didn't even understand that, because I need to understand in 1st grade what you needed to do to be able to matriculate to the 2nd grade. And what did he do that was so wrong and so off that nobody could find some redeeming qualities in this 1st grader to be able to move him to the 2nd grade. So we had a meeting, and I had to have a come to Jesus talk with my son. I'm like, listen, these people are trying to say that you don't know what you're doing, that you can't get the alphabet right, that you don't know your colors, your numbers. And, in the 1st grade, this is really fundamental stuff. And he wasn't understanding what I was saying, but he knew enough to get it right. And so when they took this benchmark test, my son just aced it, out the park. And so all I thought in that moment was, what if I went with the narrative of what the school said to me, that he needed to be retained, right? So as I considered what I would say today, or what I wanted folks to walk away with, is that this book is a beautiful representation of the undeniable power of the people, right? And so Mark said, and let's remember that before there was a term school-to-prison pipeline, there was a schoolhouse to jailhouse track, right? And way before that, just like Zakiya said, there were parents and students, Black and brown special needs students all across the nation that were being pushed straight out of schools and into the prison industrial complex, right? And so until parents, students, and community members really started sharing their individual stories, that began to surface as this collective pattern of behavior, well, now it gets interesting, right? So we saw momentum build in places like California and Mississippi, because people could relate. It wasn't just happening to my child, right? But to yours too. So that was my experience here in Richmond, Virginia. As soon as I started to tell my story and just speak out, say something, I noticed that other parents and peers had similar stories to mine. So first takeaway that I really wanted to share, right, is share and share some more, because it is your responsibility to say something. And right now I'm talking to parents and community members, right? Because we're talking about the power of this grassroots movement, right? The right people is gonna pick it up or get you to a place where you can get support, but only if you say something. So case in point, a few months ago, I'm at a car wash, right? Just being naturally sociable. I began a conversation with a young lady. She was vacuuming her car in the spot like right next to me. She expressed like her frustration with her mom, not able to get her little brother into school. They had just moved back from Jersey to Virginia. Well, he had an IEP because he had special needs. Well, what she didn't understand is what a stay put IEP was, but I did. She didn't understand that what her brother's protections were under the IDEA, but I did. So had she just not shared, like who knows how long her mother would have fought with the school system to get her little brother back in school, right? So point number one, share your story. Don't worry about the response. That's not your business. Just say something, right? This book is really based on the experiences of the impact. And I'm going to say that again. My mom used to paraphrase a scripture in the Bible that says something like, before I let a rock cry out in my place, I'm going to praise him, right? I'm going to parallel that today in point number two. Your narrative is king or queen. Don't ever let someone else tell your story. And today I'm empowering you to find creative ways to do that. I partnered, and I've for me partnered with Performing Statistics, this cultural organizing project for many years, actually since its inception, right? And so several years ago at the General Assembly Budget Committee hearings, we played recorded testimony from currently incarcerated youth for members of the Budget Committee, right? We replaced our testimony time with theirs because the impacted shouldn't be like arbitrary participants in this movement, but leading it. Right? So make sure your story is not only told, but told right. And how do we ensure that, right? How else to ensure that, but to make sure that you tell it. And point three for me really sums up both of the first two, and it's understanding leverage. Oftentimes, folks are really just afraid to come out and tell their stories or pursue resolution because they don't believe that they have the resources to impact change, right? So this young lady at the car wash, she only needed to share, right, in order to leverage the information that I knew and she didn't have. And it didn't cost her a thing, but it helped her brother get into school. The incarcerated youth, they told their stories that we shared at the General Assembly. They leveraged our activism to get them into spaces that they knew very little about and probably would have never gone to, right? And so their testimony from a confined place was integral in getting millions of dollars diverted from building a new juvenile prison. This is the power of leverage, y'all. So in 2015, the Center for Public Integrity named Virginia as #1 in the nation for school-based referrals to the criminal justice system. But when the Virginia Department of Ed official tried to minimize that report, she said that the most of the referrals didn't really, translate into a criminal conviction. I had to quickly speak up, y'all. And I said that although all referrals don't result in a criminal conviction, it does successfully build this negative disciplinary profile that makes it so incredibly easy to translate into a disorderly conduct charge. Because look how many referrals this young man has, right? And so it's the story. How many people know that part of our responsibilities, ours, and we're talking about leverage, right? Our responsibility is to maintain the integrity of that narrative. So I think that's really the core, point of this movement, sharing your story to organize and build momentum so you can help define what everybody is looking at, right? Everybody knows what they see. Before School-to-Prison Pipeline, we just knew that, Ray Ray's son kept getting suspended and expelled. And we knew that, Bessie's daughter, like I don't know why they can't keep her in school. She's always in the principal's office. You have to aggregate that data in order to really identify and define what it is we're looking at. And so really, y'all, what that boils down to is community participatory action research, right? Folks, y'all are not part of the story. You are the story. So I really wanted to say quickly about a few things that we're working on here locally in Richmond, because I know our time is short, right? So Mark already told you that this issue is intersectional. You can't possibly have a conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline without talking about mass incarceration, without talking about housing impropriety and disproportionality, employment, transportation. All of those things are really very, very closely related, right? So we started working with Dr. Zoe Spencer, my sister, in the Virginia State University Center for Policing, Leadership, and Social Justice, in conjunction with Paul Taylor and RVA League for Safer Streets, Zenobia Bay Community 50/50, Candace Lucas, Advocates for Justice, because we have to hit this state-sanctioned violence on all fronts. right? We're also working with the Legal Aid Justice Center to create a lay advocacy, partnership model to support special education families. So why is this relevant, y'all? Why is this even important? Well, last year, 2 legislators here in Virginia proposed a bill to prevent lay advocates like us from representing SPED families or special education families in due process cases. But it's part of the IDEA that protection is already in place. So Virginia sought to change that to further disenfranchise our families. This war is on multiple fronts, y'all. So it's not just in the classroom, it's not just in the schoolhouse, it's not just in the courtroom, but it's on multiple fronts, right? So my warrior sister, who Mark also interviewed in the book, Candace Lucas, she actually led the organizing of parents and other advocates, and we showed up, and our testimony helped that bill get PBI'd or passed by indefinitely, which was really a win for our families, right? We're working with the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance on a community participatory action research project on how COVID and technology impacts students across the country in the learning environment. So all I'm doing today is really encouraging you all to know the power of your own voice. This book, again, is just such a beautiful representation of the real power of the people. And we can't say that enough. We can't highlight that enough. We can't underscore that enough, because really, if the people recognize the power they had, not took their power back, but just recognize the power they had as they stand right here and right now, reading these stories, reading these narratives, like the power of the people in aggregate as a collective, just can't be stopped. Thank you all.
Am I on? That was amazing. Thank you so much, Lorraine. And thank you so much, all of you, Zakiya, Mark. Really just truly inspiring. I think the intentionality that you were just describing, Lorraine, bringing together thoughts, theories, practice around dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline with an analysis and battle against mass incarceration and other forms of policing and police abuse. You all do that in an incredibly fresh and critical way. And we are learning so much from you and so inspired by this. So I think, I was in prison yesterday, and one of our students, so just for people who don't know, I direct the Tufts' College and Prison program and reentry program for returning citizens. And I was inside yesterday talking to a 21-year-old who's in his 3rd of 10 years of a sentence, who was suspended 12 times, expelled 3 or 4 times. And just, it's so truly demoralizing, because I would say that every single one of our students is a victim of the school to prison pipeline. Every single one of them is suffering from the things that you're describing. And so that kind of demoralization, the frustration, this book and your work, Lorraine and Zakiya, just is so, I think it really is helps all of us feel a sense of hope. And so, and a sense of energy to keep going and keep connecting. And so I've been talking about the book inside this morning, and we'll continue to do that and get this book to people who are our students inside, who are very much see their role as working with you. This is what they want to do when they come out. They are teachers for people who don't understand that imbrication of criminal justice and education in this country. So just enormous thanks. So I do need to say, I know we're running short on time, but that Tufts Civic is one of the co-sponsors along with TUPIT. It fosters nonpartisan civic dialogue on key issues, open to folks from all political ideologies, and they are hosting a Continuing the Conversation informal gathering about today's event on Monday at 7 p.m. in Eaton 203 on the Medford campus. So if you want to talk about this topic, I encourage you all to be there to do that. We are very short on time, and I did want to give you all a chance to, we're thinking a lot in TUPIT, in our reentry program, My Turn, and of course, in Massachusetts and nationally about restorative justice these days. And I wanted to just throw it out to you and ask you, I spent 10 years as a high school teacher in the 80s and 90s, and I tried to do some version without knowing anything about restorative justice. And I found that the students I was working with ended up being almost more disciplinary and kind of carceral in their approach than the staff had been, but they weren't empowered in the right way. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about any kinds of successes you've seen or been part of with restorative justice in the schools. Either or all.
I can start, and then others can join in. So people may know that, when we talk about, well, what is the alternative to discipline and punishing? How do we actually support our young people? And not just that, how do we actually transform schools to become communities that are not based on discipline and punishment, but are based on a culture of relationships, of respect, of connection, of empowerment. And so restorative justice, I think, has come to embody those ideals and that kind of an alternative. It does arise out of indigenous traditions and also African-American traditions. So it's deeply rooted historically in community, not necessarily in education systems. And so it is an alternative that I think a lot of parents and young people have been pushing for a long time. And, there are places in Chicago, for example, where a group called Communities Organizing and Family Issues have been running parent-led restorative justice programs and circles in schools, and now some youth-led ones. And I think we also need to understand that there is a community-driven part about where restorative justice came from. And I think the challenge is that it is sometimes seen narrowly as, well, this is a way to address student behavior. We address bad behavior not by suspending students, but by forming a circle and having young people identify the harm that's caused and how do we repair this harm. And, certainly that's a valid piece to what needs to happen. But I think that, in our analysis, the main problem actually isn't with the students. Students are being disciplined and punished for things that are basically normal teenage behavior or normal behavior by children. And we've heard those stories already today. The problem is with the adults who have created a system that punishes and controls and disciplines young people and is based on hierarchical systems. And then I do think that when restorative justice is really brought to a school, particularly with an organizing approach, that this is really about engaging the whole school community. A lot of teachers realize that in fact, these restorative justice circles are for them. They need to come to an understanding of how are they participating in a system that is pushing students out at high numbers, and then really examine their own attitudes and beliefs, and also get support that they need to pursue alternatives and the investment in counselors and social workers and other kinds of things. So I think that when it's approached in a more holistic way, where it's based on partnerships and even sometimes led by parents and young people, and it's really about transforming relationships, not just fixing bad behavior of students, then I think that is where we see the hope that restorative justice can really be an entering wedge to transforming our schools in the way that we want them to.
Amazing. So not just a response to sort of disciplinary infractions, but instead a community building and ongoing type of activity. Amazing. So
I just wanted to add just really quickly that yes, I have seen restorative practices, so restorative justice, when it's implemented with fidelity and it's not sort of like rolled out as a program, which unfortunately some schools have done, and then they'll turn around and say, see, this doesn't work. It's not a program, it's really a philosophy. And so I have seen in Dayton, because we were able to help the school district. That was one of the other things we were able to help them do, was actually bring restorative justice to scale in the school district. They actually hired restorative justice coordinators to work and staff the wellness rooms in the elementary schools. And I have to share this really quickly. Dayton, the superintendent who we developed a relationship with at the time, she called us in and she said, you're not going to believe this, but when they looked at everything is about tests these days, when we looked at the testing data, especially for one of the schools that was considered the lowest performing. She was so shocked that after they implemented the restorative justice practices and hired a restorative justice coordinator, and young people were actually taking advantage of the wellness room, that the test scores jumped by 50%. That was just in 1 year. And I don't think Lori, she's no longer superintendent. And unfortunately, anyway, I won't share that, but her contract wasn't renewed, and people in the community believe that because she actually worked with community and worked with parents. The teachers unions, unfortunately, was not happy about that. But anyway, she shared that with us, so I had to share that with you. That was one of the data points that she was so proud of as a superintendent, and she was like, we're going in the right direction. So I just had to share that.
Amazing, amazing. We should be telling that story everywhere because that does speak to a certain set of the population that might be skeptical. Beautiful. Yeah, and amazing what a sense of belonging and community can do for somebody. All right, I'm gonna wrap with our last question for you, which is, and it's a question that Tisch College and TUPIT we're kind of always asking, and we've asked a lot of our speakers this year, but what is the work that we can do? What is something that, what is an action that people can do to it's kind of an oversimplifying question because we can follow in your footsteps and we see you all as models. But what do you think, maybe speaking to students at Tufts, is an important step toward doing the work of dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline?
Well, I'll start, Hilary, because I think I want to reiterate my last point of leverage, right? And so, like, not just at Tufts, but everywhere, it really is like important for us to understand our leverage. So Hilary, I don't have the same leverage with your audience that you do. So I'm depending on you. I'm depending on Mark to use his audience, to use his leverage with his peers to be able to bring that story in a way that won't resonate with them in the same way that if I brought it. So at the very, very basic level, that's what you can do. Have these conversations outside of academia, have these conversations at your table, have these conversations in your churches. I'm always saying that faith-based leaders, right? They have a captive audience every Sunday at 10 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever time they have service, but what are they saying? So what we can do is leverage our specific sort of impact in these individual spaces at every chance, at every opportunity. There are no, like wrong ways and wrong times to implement and to really like share these truths. And I say truths in a time, especially in Virginia, where we see our governor really, looking at, divisive concepts and critical race theory and all of these things. We really have to be about truth telling. So leveraging your individual power in your spaces is key.
And you talked about—
I'll just say amen. I have nothing to add to that.
I'll just add, I think that, I think that it can appear, I'm sure Tufts University population is diverse, but speaking to maybe the wider and more affluent sections of that population who maybe have gone through a schooling system that doesn't look as much like this that we're describing, or, happened to the few Black students who were in this more affluent district were the ones who experienced it. So maybe you haven't personally experienced it and seen it. I think it's important, two things. First of all, to understand that this system of punishment and control, it's really part of what buttresses a system of white supremacy that really supports this other form of education. These two things are linked together, and it's not particularly your fault that you grew up in that system, but now you're an adult. And so the question is, what is your responsibility? And this is a question I ask myself. I am a white man, college professor. And I think it's an issue that we all have responsibility for. And I think part of the answer is to become educated and critically minded. But part of the answer is also to go out into community honestly, and to learn, as well as to support, to contribute and to support, because I don't think that we're really going to break this system as long as we really have two different educational systems. And some people get to track their life through this affluent system, which includes Tufts University, and then go on to careers. That's what's really going to change, I think, the hearts, and not just the minds, but also the hearts of people towards racial equity and educational justice is getting out of your environment, exclusive environment, what might appear to be an exclusive environment, and out into community to really learn from the kinds of amazing community folks, the parents and young people who are out there, or returning people returning from the system have a lot to teach us. And I think that has to be the attitude in which we go out to engage with people. And I think that's the advice that I would try to give, speaking also from my own experience.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I really hope that we can continue to work together, all of us. We do have a lot of people whose stories are impacting things in the state of affairs in Massachusetts, and whose stories we're all learning from already. So Lorraine, thank you for that shout out to the power of narrative. So I hate to end this. We're a little bit over time. You all have just been so generous, and it's such an important event for us to have at Tufts. And I'm so grateful to Dean Cunningham and Jess Burns, who've organized this event. And all of the people who are in attendance. I encourage all of you to become involved in the reentry program and in the college and prison program at Tufts as well. So with that, thank you to Zakiya and Lorraine and Mark. We appreciate you. It's been wonderful, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.